moving on from that topic, or still within the topic of vulnerable narcissism, but just in the subject matter of cultural, uh, the composition of culture, and just widening the topic to a kind of cultural anthropology to some extent. Uh, because vulnerable narcissism is fundamentally opportunistic, and because this form of ideological vulnerable narcissism uh, is I mean, because it happens on the mic. Vulnerable narcissism, I'm arguing, it can be identified, although it's not so easily identified. It has not been classified into its own personality disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the psychiatric one. But the so it really is harder to capture than grandiose narcissism. But essentially, what I'm the point that I'm trying to make is that vulnerable narcissism, because it is inherently reactionary and opportunistic, it has to grab onto implements that are available in the culture at the time. And essentially, the only way that it can stabilize itself within an ideological thing is by its sort of codependency with uh, a kind of borderline personality disorder, which is fundamentally creating the wake, creating the disturbance, the disruption, the disorientation within which it can then set up its mechanics of vulnerable narcissism. Um, because it's fundamentally opportunistic, it can make its home, in broadly speaking, in this is why there is generally a pendulum, if there is one throughout history, where because essentially it can use, because it is so affixed and obsessed with these very detached abstract notions of identity. It can sort of reframe them into any kind of ideological soup. I mean, you know, it's ironic where you see authoritarian people, essentially with authoritarian sentiments and political inclinations, calling themselves liberal. It gets that kind of absurdity. Um, and they really embody all the characteristics that the supposed conservative and right leaning people were sometimes maligned as being. And so you can see this, that essentially it is a corruption of temperament. It is a temperamental, psychological kind of interface with the world. Um, and because it is opportunistic, it can make its home in any linguistic, semantic system, um, so long as it has the kinds of objects that it needs in order to set up its device. And so, because identity became uh, a cultural touchstone, became a prominent form of analysis, because post-structuralism intellectually kind of bestowed a kind of intellectual credential onto identity, um, that was exactly the kind of implement needed uh, for these individuals uh, to engage in their narcissistic uh, machinations and such, and then all of its toxic aftermath just somewhat becomes a self-fueling, self-fulfilled prophecy, where it becomes even more necessary. So it makes itself more necessity by the continued disruption that it causes, and its continued um, deluge and projected murkiness onto how to tackle the real issues, are all translated into more and more identity consciousness and identity obsession, which gets you further and further away um, of actually doing anything about development and transformation. Anyway, so I wanted to make the point about the pendulum swinging. And then in terms of the cultural, because I guess because its primary corruption essentially is the corruption of the ethical system itself. That ethical thinking becomes impossible once you've got this identity-centric worldview and paradigm essentially, and when treating people as instruments of their identity is good enough, then it will facilitate any amount of corruption, because that moral corruption will facilitate and conceal practical inefficiency and just and essentially it'll all be made okay by the scapegoating which the system allows, which essentially will be its pressure release, its ideological pressure release, but in practical terms, the whole thing will just be a devastating mess. That its own failure will be recycled ideologically as more justification for its even more radicalized agenda or whatever. Okay, there was another point that I wanted to make about the kind of the cultural outlook in this. So I mean, all the people that you're seeing that are vulnerable narcissists, have they will always associate themselves with whatever the cultural hegemony seems to be, whatever seems to be in vogue, whatever seems to be, they will just go along with it, and then they will try to deploy their vulnerable narcissistic apparatus with those implements that are available. And so these are the sort of mediocre people that you would hope would never get into university, because once they get into university, they will protect each other, they will set up networks, they will set up a kind of a clique, a groupthink, which just the force of numbers, just the quantitative kind of agreement that they can generate amongst themselves, will be how they justify their continued sort of vindication and because again, like, these things are only apparent when you are focused on the style and, let's say, the philosophical first principles and how they are intellectually dishonestly defended and promoted, which they aren't themselves sensitive to, because as vulnerable narcissists, it's not on their priority list. It's having a system that it just has to function well enough, to facilitate their personality style, as it were. But so I mean, the real problem is that this problem never ends unless you can actually get a culture that's wise to this monster, essentially, this corruption in the temperament itself, which is hard to articulate, it's hard to define, because it's wolf in sheep's clothing. It will disguise its language in the language. Sympathy can sound intellectual. So this it tries to create a whole sort of economy of intellectual sympathy, which bends and twists and fudges just interpretation of common sense even, and reality itself becomes a selectively sort of hodgepodge of take it or leave it, and just stay in your lane, and everyone has to have the same filter of sort of take it or leave it, because at the point at which you leave it, then you're accused of being a bigot and everything under the sun, or whatever, of not going along with their Um, yeah, you see, on the individual scale, it doesn't cause that much disruption. It does still cause tremendous amounts of disruption for the people in that vicinity of that vulnerable narcissist. You don't want a vulnerable narcissist to have administrative power over other people. That's going to lead to tremendous problems, but at least the problem is fundamentally localized when there's actually a kind of cohesive, um, let's say, political expression of a common sort of cultural hegemon, which is headed or characterized by this vulnerable narcissism. Um, all of its implicit, pernicious malfunctioning is going to. I mean, we're witnessing it in the corruption of the form of law itself and the imposition of legal positivism, for instance. The ethics become uh, gets sort of replaced by this moral code, which has this ends justify the means sort of thing, and it's just everything is just a narrative, and you have to accept your new role according to the new narrative, which is a counter narrative. So it's everything has to fall into alignment with this reactionary and reactive program, essentially. And essentially, if you try to argue against the kind of the polemic that they have created, then they'll come at you very, very hard. Especially if you try to distinguish your own polemic, which contradicts their own, um, because that is direct heresy. That isn't even implicit heresy or tacit heresy. That is a direct heresy which threatens their fiefdom, as it were, their ideological fiefdom, and you know. So once you actually start getting a counter polemic, then you can actually start making cultural ground against this. Now, this has never been effectively achieved in human history. You've had individuals that can see through it, that can articulate it, but it's never sort of taken hold in the culture. Hopefully, this will be an exception to the historical rule, because we have things like YouTube, which are hopefully recording and will be enough of a collective memory of this epoch that when we actually defeat these sorts of fascistic ideological uh, uh, expressions of vulnerable narcissism, that we will have a catalogue of what has happened, and we'll be able to be on guard against it, essentially, that it won't happen again, as it is happening again at the moment, culturally. Um, that we are effectively replaying the cultural development of Weimar Germany into Nazi Germany. That's what is happening right now. Um, so, you know, the slaying of this monster, the slaying of this ideological beast, which even archetypally speaking, it can be recognized that is its paradigm. It even sees itself as a beast. It is conditioned by its environment, and its environment must be put under a new dominion, under a new form of rule, a new form of pervasive and invasive indoctrination that everyone must read from the same hymn sheet. Um, the kind of the complete breakdown between the state and the public sphere. That the state must lead everything, and that the morality of this identity politics ideology must be the sort of the central processing unit at the center of policy and statecraft and the administration and interpretation of all law, as we can see in the South African Chief Justice himself. He is a vast proponent of this disgusting ideology of collective punishment. He is essentially a war criminal in the waiting. Um, that's what he speaks on. He says, never forget the past. The past is what necessitates our identity consciousness now. This is effectively what he promulgates, that we have to remember our identity consciousness and the historical significance of our identity, because otherwise we'll think that what we're doing isn't a valid form of kind of retributivistic moral balancing that is needed, and so under this, you obviously corruption is inescapable, because if people can be instrumentalized and you can overlook. I went into the details of this, but then black elite plutocrats, black millionaires, still have to have their identities promoted, because the identity is a jealous god, is an idolatry that needs to be served, and it needs to be corrected, and until the identity has a separate and equal standing to all the other identities, we must continue on in this fashion of promoting people based on their identity association, and then you can overlook actually tackling disadvantage, because it is the disadvantage that belongs to the identity foremost and not to the individual that is targeted. And this makes sense in their morality, because their morality is the direct negation of social justice. It's ironic that what they call social justice is the direct opposite of what social justice means in the Constitution, which is a non-racialist document, and they have directly infringed on the non-racialist interpretation of the law, functioning of the law. I mean, it's just, they are patent racialists. They have patently betrayed the Constitution. They are. It would be nice if at some point in the future that we do actually go through trials and we deal with the academics and the public figures, the people who said disgusting things on public radio, that said things like, I'm not saying, what did Eusebius Mackiser said, if there was a genocide in South Africa, it wouldn't be unjustified. That is exactly what he said. I actually emailed because I wanted that actual recording so I could try to make some kind of legal proceeding around it, or some kind of challenge on the basis of it. My email was just completely discarded, I guess. Because I guess that's what happens when you have this kind of cultural hegemony. I mean, what the courts wouldn't do anything anyway. They would just say, "Oh, that's valid political." When you call Pravin Gordhan a dog of white monopoly capital, and he says that this is hate speech. No, it's not hate speech, because that's valid political debate. So because he isn't white. Therefore, when you use inflammatory racial, it's just everything bends over backwards to facilitate the orthodoxy. Okay, identity consciousness. Okay, anyway, this is the thing: is that essentially you can only set up a stable, vulnerable narcissism within some form of orthodoxy. It always embeds itself within some supposed orthodoxy. So generally speaking, this kind of toxicity has generally been associated with the right, which generally has a word of conservation around it, although there's really nothing conservative about, for example, the Nazi ideology. I mean, to call it ultra-conservative is patently insane. There's nothing, I mean, the things that they want to conserve are things that in political traditions have, it has no resemblance to the Roman mentality. It has no, it's weird, but it's sort of, I think it's sort of, that conception of politics sort of came up around sort of, in the philosophical themes and times of sort of Nietzsche, um, seeing the end of the conservation of certain philosophical structures, seeing them undermined. So sort of, I think that these things only appeared after um, certain new things occurring. Nihilism initially, I think, just meant something like the newism or something like that, the negation of the old or something like that. Um, anyway, nihilism. Anyway, I mean, it is weird though, because I mean, you can see this in identity politics quite directly, that it is sort of professing to actually sort of conserve something which before has according in their perspective been overlooked and suppressed. So it is this, that's the only way that you can maintain a reactionary narrative, is you say that this thing has actually is quite old, but it's always been overlooked, and now it needs to be championed, and it needs to have its day in the sun or something like that, and in that project everything else, so it's quite a compelling orthodoxy in that, well, it's quite a totalitarian one that can get its hands into and onto everything. And so it offers the vulnerable narcissist an excessive array of reach. Yeah. So, I mean, on an individual scale, these people are toxic enough, but on a collective scale, um, when they've actually got a kind of political manifestation and platform, which, I mean, if you actually go into it, it's fundamentally nonsense. It sort of amounts to a kind of a sentimental kind of project, um, which is overlooking so many details, and obscuring so many things in order to keep its track, and its trajectory sort of, inverted commas, believable within its particular worldview. It has to protect itself from it has to somehow insulate itself from being knocked off of its perch, because it is so easy I mean, it's you have to find a way to negate just natural doubt, and natural skepticism. It's not able to defend it. It's not even able to recognize natural skepticism. So it has to sort of throw everything under the bus. It has to say, oh, reason itself, rationalism itself, logic itself, is all a white conspiracy or something like that. It has to really say quite strange things. It has to sort of outsource everything that stops it from, in its view, making progress. Now, when you see this happening on a micro scale in terms of vulnerable narcissism, like, you might believe that this actually, that something horrendous is going on or something like that, if you only hear their side of the story. But if you actually, sort of start compiling other people's opinions, and you start looking with your eyes or finding other bits of evidence from other sources, and compiling what the actual, what's actually been going on, you get two very, very different versions of events. And a lot of what vulnerable narcissism depends on is they depend on a very fixed interpretation of everything. There is only one interpretation. There's one orthodoxy, and because they can depend on those rules, as it were, they can navigate safely, because they've got this one size fits all solution, and or style of navigation, and they will, and if they are ever in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's always somebody else's fault, essentially. Um, so it's invulnerable to a large degree. Sorry, I went into this point. Sorry, I'm getting quite abstract. I went into this point before, about how the same theme crops up. I mean, it is slightly more complicated in that when I say rule, that the rules are fixed in some sense, it's like it's the same pattern of that kind of rule, because essentially the rules are even inconsistent and they change, but it's that because that's why they're codependent, this kind of borderline personality disordered identity, is because um, essentially they know the final outcome must be that answer, and your workings out essentially are the rules, which essentially you can have different types of rules that get you to the same position. So you can actually you can depend on each one of those rules, even though that they might be mutually exclusive, even though that they might be inconsistent with one another. It doesn't matter. Um, so that kind of cognitive dissonance there, in terms of that the process is fundamentally dishonest and deceptive, it doesn't matter, because essentially there's no alternative to ideate over achieving the same kind of outcome for the identity. And essentially the means must work in step with the outcome that the identity deserves, because otherwise the ideology and its moral pretensions aren't being because it's not so much, they don't even care if the solution happens or not. They care if the reasoning in their vision is the thing that facilitates, must be regarded as the appropriate cure. And essentially, because the appropriate cure, the method, the formula, necessitates this kind of sadistically edged treatment, which also has a whole lot of double standards attached to it. That is just an intellectual exercise in trying to contain those double standards and try to rationalize them, and try to create a kind of a system in which the ideology can sort of coalesce around, and try to create a cohesive. I mean, this is something that doesn't ever happen, but that is something of the call of the Führer principle. That the idea is that you're going to be able to set up a sort of a system of law. But it'll be interesting, because this is why the law that they make is so disgusting. It really is. It's so ad hoc. It's so heavy on the administrative side. It doesn't follow from its visionary principles into its processes. It doesn't actually have that. It just has these sort of, it has supposedly these goals that it wants to achieve, and then it has these mechanisms, and then if these things don't actually parallel with each other, it's just by definition the law says that these are the processes that achieve those goals. That is just taken as writ. That is just that is the culture of legal positivism, effectively, that that means that you don't have the rule of law anymore. You have the rule of man, fundamentally, because it's merely the interpretation of some men who are ideologically bestowed with now these new titles, which were never in the original constitution, like the Chief Justice. The president of the Constitutional Court was never to be called the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice was a fine title to have for the Supreme Court of Appeals, which is not the highest court in the land. It was a wonderful novation that we had a president of the Constitutional Court of the presiding over constitutional matters, and it was a supreme constitution, and he was a president of that court. To call that man the Chief Justice, uh, as if he has some kind of ability to be able to look at the purpose of a legislation and divine and suck his thumb and say to himself that uh, uh, yes, the ideology that the government of the day is using is going to be the savior of the people, and I don't have to test these processes against pragmatism. I don't have to test them against common sense, that we can see how much corruption is occurring in the government. I don't have to look at reality, in fact. I can just look at this ideological reality, um, and that I'm looking at everything through, that I'm looking at even jurisprudence through. And uh, I will just be seduced by the law of man. You know, that is what we have. Um, and in fact, he is, that is what he is the promoter thereof. You know, it's sort of, if you've watched the movie Conspiracy, um, which is about a group of some legal people, some political people, a lot of generals sitting around a table talking about uh, the development of the final solution. You know, and you look at the kind of ideological machinations and the kind of horse trading that goes on, and the kind of those are the kinds of internal issues that is dealing that are dealt with in the kind of corrupted legal culture that we have now, and the kind of form of corrupted law and the form of corrupted statecraft that we have now. But these, of course, are all facilitated by, I mean, you could say that the corruption in the culture itself, and in the media, who their commentary and their I guess you could say they never really got a non-racialism. They're not interested, um, and in fact, it's quite nice selling vulnerable narcissists outrage. You know, it's quite easy. It's quite cheap to do so. Um, Clickbait, as it were. Uh, you know, that's the mentality. More reactive fuel. Um, I wanted to make some sort of more general points, though, just about the cultural outlook itself. Yeah, so I mean, generally, culture itself is not really that permissive of vulnerable narcissism. Usually, vulnerable narcissists have to. I mean, you could see this growing up in junior school and high school, that certain people will have as character traits. They will perhaps be narcissists. There'll be lots of different types of people, and vulnerable narcissists will be often at the center of quite a lot of conflict, which they might be not the immediate. They might not look like that they are actually creating, but which they have actually choreographed and lined up, in almost a Machiavellian kind of way. they're very good at making themselves look like emotional, that they are just conveying their emotional truth, that's the language in which it's oh, that's the authenticity, or the height of authenticity, which their sort of temperament is capable of conveying. I mean, these people are. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now, because essentially we have a whole generation, uh, a, a large proportion. I mean, even if it is a vocal minority, it's still a large proportion of the population is now somewhat acclimatized to belonging to a kind of a group think of vulnerable narcissism. These people are basically, uh, they are, you know, um, they are racialist at their core. They're identity centric. They have the fascistic worldview of society. That is how, and this is the point that I didn't emphasize, that I was trying to emphasize right at the start, which I didn't, is that they are opportunistically looking for a way to use their one solution that fixes all the problems, which is effectively the envy thing that I went into. Essentially, that if they can interpret something uh, which their vulnerable narcissism can react to, um, if they can sort of interpret something as a slight against them, in that they're, I mean, this gets more subtle, that essentially they're envious of their hypothetical selves that should have already been uh, validly validated, or should have been valid, or should have been sort of bestowed with something, or should have been something, should have been read into them. They should have been more carefully listened to. That they should have been more carefully attended to. Uh, um, they should already be understood. I guess this is generally called entitlement. Their sense of entitlement. Yeah, that's the more generic sort of notion that comes along with narcissism. Their sense of entitlement, which is, you know, um, it's very easy to interpret situations according to a sense of entitlement, to project that deficiency of things that they are deserved. Um, and when that essentially is your go to apparatus, uh, obviously they might even hold themselves back to some extent to know in what, um, depending on the social makeup, depending on the atmosphere, depending on the audience, the particular makeup of the audience even involved, there are different things that you'll be able to that they will be able to project as being able to get away with. So in some sense, they always want to express this sense of entitlement, this sense of envy. They're trying to find the excuses, the enabling instruments and social sort of atmosphere and context which permits them to indulge in that entitlement. And so, because they're always looking to construct better and better compositions to guarantee them the leeway and the freedom to indulge in that entitlement, and that, let's say, that mechanism, that reliable mechanism in which everything is reactive. So, obviously, if they're new and they don't know how people are going to interpret what they're going to say, and they're strangers looking at them and they don't know what the power dynamics are, that forces them into a valence in which it's very hard to deploy these. I'm talking about the individual vulnerable narcissist. Obviously, with identity politics, it's completely different because then they are never alone. They always have the identity to depend on, to rely on, to deploy, to and hold themselves out as an avatar and representative of the identity matrix, which is already involved with everyone. So they've kind of already got this interface which they believe, or that they would like the orthodoxy thereof to be able to force people to deal with them through that interface, in which they can reliably depend on their vulnerable narcissism. Now, this has its own toxic effect because these people essentially, they're unbearable. And the only way to bear with them is to sort of give them some sort of fresh meat, to give them some blood to drink. And so you have to live in a mixed environment in order to feed them, the some form of cannibalism, because they're going to get hungry and go after their own people if you can't find a sort of a source of nourishment for them. Um, I mean, these are fundamentally problematic. You can see why it doesn't work when these people actually control a government, when they control a society. Why then the society is fundamentally in a doom spiral, which, for example, South Africa is because these are the kinds of mentalities of the people that are in charge. These are the people that hold the political hegemony, essentially, or enough of them do, and you can't get rid of them. They're too entrenched. For example, in the ANC, you're not going to be able to dislocate them because the ANC institutionally has already been acclimatized to facilitating them. And so you'd have to revamp the whole thing, and it's just institutionally not capable of doing that. If there was, there would probably be a coup overnight and a genocide overnight. They probably would just accelerate their plans, essentially. I mean, I think there are deeper aspects of this. I think the model of the Rainbow Nation and the New South Africa and non-racialism was a threat to the rest of African countries which use these same kinds of in-group, out-group, tribal identity constructs, essentially, within their culture to facilitate and conceal corruption. And so, South Africa was at least ideologically model, even though it wasn't perhaps following it, especially after Thabo Mbeki. But during Thabo Mbeki and before then, between 1993 and the end of Thabo Mbeki, South Africa was an ideological model of essentially clean government and relatively, a clear trajectory to development and transformation and progress. Um, Obviously, because we weren't clear enough about certain aspects of non-racialism, the whole project was able to eventually be opportunistically grabbed onto and molded by the vulnerable narcissists, which in a greater sense were facilitated by whatever this intellectual atmosphere of post-structuralism and that kind of garbage, which you can even see supposed revolutionaries like Russell Brand talking about, you know, the gift to plutocrats and dictators and bad governments everywhere. What a wonderful gift Russell Brand bestows upon and who are and this journalistic class of supposed revolutionaries, um, which are, I guess, all themselves in this economy, this bad faith economy of vulnerable narcissism, effectively. And their idea is that they're going to feed the vulnerable narcissistic appetite and sentiments of the people, and they're just giving the people what they want. This is the function of the media, essentially, is to create an ideology in which uh, you can create an abstract moral code in which you can just promote the identity, and it's it's a very disgusting, alien, anti-human ideology, the fascistic simplification and factionalization of society, um, to facilitate a kind of self-righteousness that just has bad outcomes everywhere in every aspect. Anyway, sorry, I always get into these rants about just how evil this scourge is. Okay, so what was that point that I was just trying to emphasize? Is that what was it? What was I going on about? The outrage. The hardest thing uh, will be in effectively culturally tackling this group of people who are now completely programmed into vulnerable narcissism. I mean, I do think actually a large degree of them could see the error of their ways. They could be deprogrammed. They could, find and understand some of the things that I'm talking about and compare that with their own experience of their own ideology and their own mindset of their own ideology, and realize the decadence and depravity and projection, and how it facilitates essentially this intellectual cult of sympathy, which bends the truth to such an extent that, the idea that, oh, you're bending the truth but it's for the right outcome, but actually in the process of bending the truth just to supposedly facilitate that outcome, you facilitate a whole slew of secondary effects of depravity and corruption, which ends up being reveled in. That kind of disruption is seen as progress to some degree, as even moral progress. But it's so hinged on essentially a sadistic enemy that is being touted as the cause, and then you can't even track the causes of the secondary sort of self-poison and the self-toxification of implementing these incoherent uh, uh, forms of loose thinking and double standards and things like that. And the idea that the right people are going to have these powers. The right people are going to have these ad hoc, powers. That the government can be trusted with expropriation, without compensation, without judicial review. Um, But it is problematic because a vulnerable narcissist will have to live within their narrative, essentially. Uh, they will have to construct a narrative, and they will always be agitating to make that narrative as broadly applicable as possible and deployable as possible. And if you remove identity politics in its current social hegemony, which hopefully is in the process of happening, that the pendulum is swinging the other way, as it were, that people are identifying that, oh no, the proponents of this are toxic individuals. Which, I mean, to that, there is some recognition to that, but there is a focus on the ideology itself, when I think it also bears looking at the psychology of the adherent. I mean, in some sense now, the problem is that you've got these, let's say, militarized, vulnerable narcissists that are going to feel entitled to believing in an orthodoxy that has cultural hegemony. And in that context, when you already have a group of people that are like that, I mean, you can start to understand the actions of Pinochet to some degree. Because a lot of people that Pinochet didn't murder and assassinate and kill in the death squads, that were essentially just taken in and sort of roughed up and then released or sort of imprisoned indefinitely. I mean, we're talking about human rights abuses. But in practical terms, it did actually ameliorate the immediate radicalization. Just those interventions, the ones in which murder weren't used, it was very interesting because I think that, well, perhaps there was some kind of post-traumatic stress which ended up becoming a kind of a more prominent personality disorder, which somewhat displaced the elements of vulnerable narcissism. It somewhat diffused, at least that. But anyway, I mean, I believe culturally it would be better if what we could do is we could create a consciousness of awareness about the perniciousness of vulnerable narcissism, and we leave them within the culture to continue to be a bad example to the rest of us, and to continually use them and point at them as being the problem. These are the same temperaments of people that have always been what has held us back as a species. They have always been the ones destroying real progress because of wanting to indulge and be drunk on their sentiments and their feelings and their pathological corruption of ethics in order to facilitate their sadistically edged, Stefan Molyneux, for instance, has a very good explanation of how essentially women have used the presumption of their moral purity essentially to facilitate their all the holy cows that you can imagine have been used by vulnerable narcissists as shields to perpetrate endless amounts of suffering and trauma and ongoing chain pathology. And until we have the moral courage to blame the victim and to say, you have this thing, you might not be able to be cured of it, but we're not going to be infected by it. We're not going to let the general body politic go along for the ride, and we're not going to let you facilitate corrupt political masters and invest in your economy of identity obsession and idolatry. And we're not going to sort of get to move our rationalism and our knowledge into alignment with your petty and specious relativistic machinations, just to facilitate your grandstanding and your field marshalling in the moment, just to be able to represent and to have this narrative that you can project onto people at will and such. Those are that will be the gold standard at which we can know that we can live through these cultural moments, and that we will have diagnosed the true underlying a monster within the human condition, as it were. And until we do that, there's not going to be there's not going to be effective coordination and collaboration within society, because it's going to only be on the terms of their corrupted version of coordination and collaboration, which is effectively what they have, which is the invalidation of social justice and the promulgation of what can only be described as collective punishment for historical collective guilt. And this is what passes as for a chief justice. I guess I was going to make the point is that it would be nice though to eventually develop the real jurisprudence where these people are effectively judged. We need a corrective legal measure at some point that actually puts the constitutional supremacy back in focus. And these people and their crimes and betrayal of the Constitution must not go unpunished. I'm talking about actual court proceedings. I'm not talking about kangaroo courts. I'm not talking about vigilanteism. I mean, in the future, we're going to need something like a Nuremberg trials. Then I think we will have confidence that the country, political consciousness in general, has also matured, and that the South African experiment and the form of law and its framework is the most advanced in the world by far. I mean, it has been obscured and sullied and defiled and is fundamentally dead, but in its resurrection, these things must be vindicated. These things must come to the fore, that they must re-emerge. And perhaps with truth and reconciliation, that will be the best way that we will have a record of the truth, that we will have a record of what human civilization should be and could be and how it functions.